Last 6 months have been hard.
For all of us. But I need to know you're with me.
Yeah.
Hello, and welcome to our The Last of Us HBO Spoilercast, where each week we'll be reacting to the latest episode and talking in depth about what we've watched. I'm Phil, or AK Black and Red, and on this channel I talk about The Last of Us a lot, along with other survival and horror-themed video games, so if that's your thing, be sure to subscribe. This week I'm joined by Abby, aka Opaling Cosplay, producer for Spores Productions, who made The Last of Us Part 2 fan film All We Lost, in which she played Ellie, the official Atreus cosplayer for God of War Ragnarok, and cosplay championship judge at this year's Insomnia Gaming Fest.
Hi.
Dee, a slam poet, PhD researcher, and sex blogger, as well as being fortunate enough to be married to me.
And I thank the gods every day.
As you should. KDB, who is a veteran at this point of video game fan podcasts with not only the fantastic Resident Evil podcast First Aid Spray, but also Fallout podcast Tapes from the Waste and Gears of War podcast Gears Intel.
Hello.
And Will from Resident Evil Central, the place to go to keep up with survival horror game news and the largest Resident Evil fan accounts on Twitter, as well as my co-producer for the Horror Game of the Year Awards.
Hello.
As the name implies, spoilers lie ahead for the 8th episode of the HBO series, so if you haven't watched it yet, then I highly recommend you do so before watching this. We'll also be talking about the game up to the same point in the story, but you don't have to have played it to be able to follow along. Just be aware that we will be comparing and contrasting at some point, so if that's considered a spoiler for you, then maybe consider that. With all that out the way, let's dive in. So, just to kind of recap where we're up to, after Joel was nearly fatally wounded at the end of episode 6, in episode 7 we had Ellie recall how she was bitten and Riley's message of fighting for every second you can with someone to care for, reinforcing her need to keep Joel alive. So we saw her stitching him up, but as of episode 8 she needs food and medicine, and that's how she runs into the leader of a local community nearby, a man called David, and everything else kicks off from there. So, David, as you might gather, is not a popular character. So, I mean, let's start off with our overall review of the episode before we kind of dive into the details. But, KTB, I want to start with you, if that's all right, because you're kind of coming from the perspective of, you know, the major details of the game, but you've never played it. So your kind of main immersion into the story is the show. So, I mean, before talking about this episode specifically, what's it been like as far as kind of experience? I think none of us have got to experience it as fresh as that. Kind of, we've all either played it or, in Dee's case, watched me play it endless times. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about how that feels.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I kind of wish I didn't know as much as I do. I said to you before we started recording, just because of how kind of prominent The Last of Us is, and I don't live under a rock, I do know a lot about the games and the key events of the games. That being said, I wouldn't say it's had any... I don't feel like the show has been affected or spoilt for me by that. I feel like that anything can happen on the show. I don't think the fact that I know about the games or don't know about the games has any, you know, real meaning. Beyond those Easter eggs and stuff, which I also mentioned to you, I think it's just been nice to experience it as a good TV show. I mean, you kind of, yeah, I watch it with the games kind of far from my mind, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's been cool to kind of finally get on, I suppose, the Last of Us hype train, which I've never really been on. You know, it's one of the games that everyone says, you have to play this, it's incredible, one of the best games of all time, and all that stuff that you hear. I'm sure it's a fantastic game. It looks great. I've just never had the opportunity to play it, but really, really loving the show.
Yeah. Good stuff. I mean, I think from that perspective, that's kind of where people have talked about other adaptations that are like really good, like for example, Arcane. That's kind of the same perspective I come in. I've never played League of Legends. I have no idea about it, but I can still kind of appreciate that as a fantastic show and fantastic story. But in terms of episode 8 specifically, so do you want to give your kind of overall take on the episode?
Yes. Okay. I mean, I think is a very, very strong episode. I'm going to be honest. Like, so with this show, I think more than anything else, this show is just about the performances. It's a genre show with zombies in and all this kind of stuff, but really, really, it's about characters and performances. And this, for me, was one of those sort of perfectly balanced genre show with character stuff. Like last week's episode, I really liked last week's episode. There was a point while I was watching it where I felt like I was potentially watching some of it felt a bit like deleted scenes. And I don't want that to sound like a really big criticism, because it's not, because I loved the episode. And by the end of the episode, like anybody watching it, I was very upset, and it's a huge gut punch and all this kind of stuff. So I did really like last week's. Something that this show has done a few times is take a big breather and just focus on the characters. I have nothing against that. Episode 3 is like one of the greatest things I've ever seen. But then this episode kind of brought it back to really powerful character stuff, but with some sort of high drama, leading towards the end and things like that. So yeah, this for me was really, really strong. I think that this was a huge step up in what the show's been doing to kind of advance the characters in terms of making the audience question what they think about the characters and what they're doing, and if they're good people, and who's right and who's wrong. Like, there's all these big questions this episode asked. So yeah, really, really strong. Generally, cinematography, I think it was probably visually my favorite episode. I think the snow, classic Western look and all that, contrasting with the fire at the end, there was lots to love. Even just like the kennels and the little shack that David and Ellie are sitting in, just visually, like, the episode was stunning. And yeah, coming off the back of last week, where although I loved last week's episode, I wasn't blown away in the same way that like episode 3 and episode 5 absolutely blew me away. This was another big one. I think this was a really, really strong episode overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go next to Will. Do you want to give us your take?
Yeah. No, it's. I think if we were going to sum up the episode with just one word, I think it's just violence altogether. And it's been really interesting to see. It's a polar opposite to the past 2 episodes, where we had all this the hope and the humanity and the fantastic relationships that you can have. And then this episode just brought us really back down to completely the opposite side of humanity, and how nasty things can get and what people will do to survive. And it really brought that dark tone which I've been looking for. And the end part with David, that scene with David and Ellie, was fantastic to see. It really had me worried for her, and it really brought that the really true feelings of how horrible it has been for them and what they've been through now. But yeah, that's my overall sum, really.
Cool. Dee?
I would sum it up with 2 words, and those words would be baby girl. Because when Joel was going off, I was literally screaming at the telly, "God, Joel, go get your baby girl!" And then when he said, "I got you, baby girl," I just lost my shit.
Yeah.
I think that it was beautifully done, especially the David Ellie stuff, because if you've played or watched the games, you know that there's a much more sexually predatory element to that encounter in the game. But I think they did show not tell on that. And I think when he just looked at her with that sinister look and said, "There is no fear in love," you knew what he was talking about. They didn't have to do what they did in Game of Thrones and put women through needless absolutely needless trauma and assault, and they didn't do what was that game you played, Phil? That one where there was the absolutely unnecessary scene where the character who looked very much like Elliot Page
that
was
will
in the
be
bar.
Beyond Two Souls, but I mean
That's the one.
that was written by David Cage, so that's why women
Well,
aren't treated
yeah.
well in it.
Oh yeah, but they did that, and that was unnecessary. They could have got away with doing that in the show last night on Monday, and they didn't go there. And I actually want to applaud them. We're recording this on International Women's Day, go us, and for them not to have put a woman through unnecessary trauma just for titillation of viewers, I think is something that we should be applauding.
Yep. Cool. And Abby, do you want to round us off with the reviews and what you think?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much echo everyone else's statements, and I was very vocal last week that I was dreading David, because knowing how they've adapted the show and how they've gone more in depth with the characters, I sort of was like, oh, he's going to be creepier. And for me, I almost feel the opposite in the way that he was more sexual in the TV show than the game. Especially that throwaway comment at the start where he mentions he was a school teacher for kids Ellie's age. Just little bits like that. And again, yeah, visually I absolutely loved it as well. I thought the cinematography in this one was really beautiful in the way that it was just such a cold episode. In the others we have a lot of bright colours, and in the last episode we had the neons in the arcade, and before we get quite a lot of green, but this one was so cold. And even Ellie, like inside when she's like in the tiled room, just everything felt really uncomfortable. And you can kind of, it had that feeling of like, obviously David like stripping everything away human and just making it as like cold and distant as possible. I feel like we're completely honest on this podcast, and I want to say I think this was the first episode where I had a little bit of a gripe with the pacing, and I did feel like there was a little bit of that struggle of it not having the context of a video game, of getting from A to B and meeting a bunch of like NPCs and killing a bunch of people to get there. Because the end, I'll talk about it a bit more later, but like the end of the episode where the barn was on fire and we just saw Ellie and Joel walk away at the end, and the fact that no one else was there felt quite empty. So I felt for the first time, actually, like truthfully, that this did suffer a little bit with video games TV show, but that's like my only gripe.
Yeah, I get what you mean. Like in the game, Joel pulls her off because she's not stopping, and in the TV series, she stops on her own and runs out the door, and then Joel is there. It did feel a little bit, well, where did Joel come from? So yeah, I get that with you.
It was almost I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself talking about this. I'll hold off. We'll go chronologically. But I just felt that's important to mention as a first overview thought.
Yeah. I mean, I will say I kind of get that, and as you say, we'll come into that in more depth, because there's a few questions around kind of the way they've avoided I suppose the more video gamey elements of the game in focusing on the story and the characters and everything, and whether that's always a good thing or there's downsides to it and stuff. But I mean, I agree with what everyone said as far as like the qualities of this episode. I think this one of the things that stood out to me, again, this is kind of highlighted just how good a performer Bella Ramsey is and I think particularly on those scenes where there's that high level of emotion and intensity, that's where she shines the most. And that's why kind of, I mean, there's never been like a bad performance, but it's almost been like we've had to wait until the point where, she's shoving Joel and saying everyone's left me except for you, or with Riley, or with this and that moment with David when she kind of manages to overpower him and like shove the hatchets in his face. And that's where all the best possible performance from her kind of pours out. And that there's a whole lot of that. I think that really showcases like exactly why she was cast, I think, in there. But the other thing, just kind of picking on some of the stuff that people have said about the way it was set up and the coldness of it, the thing that kind of struck to me was that we had snow back in episode 6, obviously when we were in Jackson, but we also had like Jackson was almost like this beacon of warmth in the middle of like the desert and in not deserts, what's tundra would be the opposite, but in the middle of all that cold, there's something warm. Whereas this is kind of that town had no warmth to it whatsoever. It was just more coldness until the fire almost cleansed it of everything that David was doing, like when Ellie set the restaurant on fire. And it kind of, we talked a few episodes back about the level of kind of hope that we saw in things like Jackson, in things like the way Bill had survived and managed to live that life, and the kind of hope that we don't necessarily see in zombie shows. Particularly The Walking Dead is known for the very cynical, more dark stuff, more people like David than people like Jackson and Bill. So I think that sort of sharp contrast was really good. I mean, and it's kind of pointing out that, there's lots of hope, but there's still these people out there and there's still this story to tell. But I also think in terms of performances, Scott Shepherd's performance as David was fantastic. Like he brought something to it.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, not to knock Nolan North's voice performance in the game. Like he the fact that the guy who voiced Nathan Drake also managed to do that like low sort of creepy voice was just like fantastic. But yeah, there was something about it, and like that sort of it's very American. I think that sort of like folksy charm, religiosity with the underpinning of threat and just kind of something very wrong underneath it all. So I was very much impressed by that. But I think it's time to kind of dive in and talk in more detail. So, I mean, do we want to pick up that point where we left off and talking about the lack of extra characters and like how that felt? Like the fact that the town was basically empty at the point where Joel came to save Ellie, and then obviously Ellie saved herself and came outside.
Yeah, it's a completely fair point. I mean, it's a TV show. Things like this happen, and you think they make these choices. All I'm going to do is be devil's advocate and say, well, the place was burning down. Maybe they all ran away. I don't know. But again, you can apply any kind of logic you want to it. I think if it takes you out at the moment, it's completely fair enough, because I've thought that a couple of times with some of the end. Like some of my biggest gripes with this show are some of the endings of the episodes. So it's in the same sort of way. So I completely get what you're saying.
It's not. It's again. It would have ruined the moment if suddenly like a bunch of people came out at the end and was like, So I don't know how they would have rectified it. I just feel there was a little bit of that tension almost lost of being overpowered in terms of like the group, because I felt like they were setting up for a really strong at the start, obviously when David was with I don't know what you'd call them, like the group, and they were all so loyal to him and they were like so angry at Joel and the deaths of their people. I felt like it was setting up for something a little bit, it almost felt like Far Cry 5-ish, like just one hive mind. That was almost a reflection of, the Cordyceps and how David gets into their brains and they're all this one thing. But again, it would have ruined the moment if suddenly a bunch of people came out and was like, oh no. So I don't know how it would have rectified it. I almost felt it was a bit rushed at the end, which was a shame.
I think that, sorry.
No, I'm done.
Okay. I think that that David kept saying about how everybody listened to him and everybody would do what he said, but I think it was quite plain that he was actually losing a lot of that control, especially over the food. I said to Phil at the time when he got back and it was like, oh, eat your food. Everybody else had a bowl with a shallow bit of food at the bottom, and David sat there with a plate with loads of what I'm assuming was arse steak. He was and I think people knew, because people still, you would think that if they were that hungry that they would be going, oh, okay, we've got some venison, let's eat that. But people weren't eating it. I think people knew that this wasn't actually venison, and David was already losing people anyway, because then when James, and big up my boy Troy Baker, when James was like, actually no, and then and that was he was he was about to shoot Ellie until James told him to stop. And I think at that point, had he turned around and went, no, I'm still going to shoot her, it would have been a whole different thing. So he had to listen to David at that point rather than risk an outright rebellion. But I don't think David had as much control as he thought he did.
No.
No, definitely not. I'm also wondering with the with how empty it felt. I wonder if, because how controlling David is, I wonder if he confined them to like a certain building or a certain room, and that's why there was no one around. Because obviously, with how they looked as well, they seem very much, they don't see sunlight and they don't go out at all. So I'm wondering if they're playing that side of it to play advocate to it, of course.
Yeah.
No, I get that. I get that completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that in terms of talking about adapting it from a game to a show, that there is that kind of fine tightrope to walk, because in the game they add the combat elements, so you say to kind of split those things apart, and that kind of explained where the townspeople were, because you'd either snuck past them or murdered them all, depending on what kind of play style you went through. But they kind of explained that in the game by they add some dialogue where after kind of Ellie escaped and before she gets to the restaurant, there's that scene you got to kind of sneak through a whole bunch of townspeople, and that David tells everyone that she's gone missing and to find her, and then you overhear two other of his men saying he's gone too far this time. We need to have a town meeting and vote him out. And like earlier on, when the horse is shot, and again another combat scene, they're saying, you know, oh, if she's the one who killed all the people at the university, then screw David. We're not going to take her alive. We're going to kill her. And it's more explicit in that way. But then that kind of, I think obviously there's a sense of which if you put all that in and made it more explicit, that episode adds an extra half hour maybe to the runtime. But also you've got that kind of thing of, if you try and put anything like that in, how realistic is it in the world they've set up and the way they've set it up, and kind of the transformation that Ellie goes through from, she's obviously quite trying to be cocksure, but she's very unsure when she's confronted with David and James, like to sort of all of a sudden be sneaking around everyone and like, you know, maybe killing a few of them or whatever. It kind of think it's a difficult one to call, but I think there is definitely a tightrope to walk in there in terms of either just cutting that out entirely or trying to acknowledge it.
Yeah. No, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. I think that's what I was expecting, that transition of Ellie escaping, going through the town to the restaurant, as opposed to just suddenly being escape restaurant.
Yeah.
I feel like that could have been padded out a tiny bit. But again, I feel like I'm making this a lot more dramatic than it needs to be. That was just literally my one observation, where I felt at the end Joel and Ellie were just kind of walking away, and I was like, okay.
I didn't even notice that, to be honest. Probably because I was too busy laughing about the fact that Ellie and I both have something in common, which is we've broken a man's finger on purpose.
I'm not even going to ask.
And on next week's episode,
Yeah, we're not going to get into the story of how that happened here, because I know the story.
I'll just say somebody was handsy and shouldn't have been handsy, so I broke his finger.
Valid. Happy
Deserved,
International Women's Day.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of whole discussion about where the sort of the combat, the gameplay stuff kind of feeds into another thing which has been kind of talked about more, particularly in recent episodes, is about kind of the presence of the infected and kind of where are they versus, like, I think in terms of big infected scenes, we've seen it in, like, we've obviously had the episode 1 with the outbreak, and then after that we had the big moment with the clickers, and then with the ending with Tess, and then we had obviously episode 5 and the bloater and that whole sort of scenario. But apart from that, and then the one who was involved in episode 7's events, we've not really seen them elsewhere. And I mean, we've discussed this a little bit on previous episodes, but I think people are talking about more. Is this something which you think there should be more in there? It kind of takes it away from it, or is less more? Is it better that they kind of kept them to those big moments that kind of shock you and throw something in? So I don't know if Dee, do you want to go first this time? Talk about what your thoughts on it.
I think they've got the balance right on it. It's, if you want loads and loads of zombies, go and watch Walking Dead. It's as simple as that. This isn't like the Cordyceps monsters. That's not what it's called. It's called The Last of Us, talking about the humans. And the infected do play into that a bit, where they are also the last of humanity, because they are actually still alive until they get ganked. But like, oh, for goodness sake, if people have got too much time on their hands, honestly. I know it
You're going to
sounds
love
really
my response.
probably. I just think that there's the right amount of infected in the show. Had the show had infected on Monday, had episode, what are we on now? 9.
9's next. This is 8.
9's next. 8. If episode 8 had infected in it as well, honestly, I would have been like, shush, out the way. I want to see what's going on with David, because David was the monster. And then we got to balance that out with, is Ellie also a monster? Violent-hearted, is she? Oh, behave. She's a child who's a product of her circumstances. Like, it's like, don't try and make out you're the same. This is not the same as a wedding. Ooh, nonsense. Didn't like it. And the teacher thing, the teacher got me as well. Teacher to preacher. No. But yeah, I was too invested in the whole David thing, what was going to happen. Had there been infected as well, I'd have been like, go away. You're distracting from this storyline. And you know I'm all about the writing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from what you've said, then I think it's makes sense to go to the KDB next and see what your take is.
Well, while I mean, I agree, like, with a lot of what you're saying. I think I just would come at it slightly differently. And firstly, it's difficult to form an opinion completely until the show is done, until we've seen the whole story, and whether that's season 1 or subsequent seasons, to then go, did they use the infected enough? I mean, we can talk about so far, and I think they've it is about balance. I do think the infected have been underused, and because it is a genre show, and although the character work it's phenomenal, as I said, this is a character show. It's about the performances more than anything. It's some of the best stuff I've seen in years. I have on occasion thought that this show is kind of trying to have its cake and eat it, where what it's doing is it's saying, hey, look, here's some more time with these characters. Let's flesh them out. Let's give you more context and make you care more, which I'm all for. But you do run the risk of the infected becoming pointless to the whole kind of experience. Now, I don't want them to just do The Walking Dead and just have zombies all the time, crowds of zombies, because the zombies became pointless in that for different reasons. And I think if they're going to show infected, anytime they show them, it should be to do something you haven't seen, or kind of present them in a new way that makes them more threatening. And for the most part, that's what this show has done. It's what it did with the original Outbreak. It's then what it did when you first saw the clickers in the museum, and how they, how kind of threatening they are. The next time you saw them, they introduced the bloater and the sort of mob of infected. Since then, anytime we've seen the infected, it's been a step back from there. And although I don't want them to overuse it, I just think the show, the character stuff is keeping me watching, but I can't help but feel just another 5 minutes here and there advancing the dangers of the infected would be good. To just reestablish them as that series threat, because they've basically been AWOL. I know, Phil, like you said, we had a brief appearance last week, and although I enjoyed that, I just feel like at the moment the infected are secondary to what I'm watching, which it's hard to say whether that's right or wrong, because as I say, the show isn't over yet. I feel like I could do with seeing a bit more of them, and so my hope is, it's the finale coming up. They'll do something there that sort of just, it goes, oh, that's why, I've invested my time. I don't need to worry. They had this plan and it pays off. Here's the infected. Yeah. And I don't need to worry. So it's just kind of how I feel at the moment. But yeah, maybe I'll change my mind once the finale's finished. Yeah. There better be some infected in the finale. If there's not, I'll be very upset.
Yeah. So, Abby, what about yourself?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with both sides. I'm in agreement that the show is called The Last of Us. It's about the humanity, it's about the characters, and that's what And Naughty Dog in general, not even just The Last of Us, have always been amazing at. And getting to see more backstory and more character time of like characters themselves has been amazing. And it makes sense that there's not a lot of infected. You know, we're 20 years ? Is it still the same time period? 20 years into the future after the infection first broke out. There's QZs and everything, and you know they've kind of like chipped away at the infected. So it makes sense that there's not a lot around. And going into the whole Cordyceps thing and like fungal thing, it makes sense that they kind of try and stay away almost from humans and stay in dark places and whatever. But at the same time, they do feel like the infected do feel like a bit like a tool, and they're just kind of brought in at convenient times, which I guess, you know, is the point of any character and any creature. You know, they're brought in to be a threat and they're brought into, but I felt like the reveal of the bloater didn't do it justice because it was just part of like a big group, whereas you kind of lost that threat of Joel and Ellie being like back in the game, being in the school like locked in this one room with this bloater. I feel like we lost that like, oh, this is like a big threat. And I feel it's also important to note again that we lost a whole section with David and Ellie fighting off infected together, because in the game David and Ellie get like trapped, and it almost cemented that thing of like,
Yeah.
So David and Ellie
that's interesting.
David and Ellie get trapped together in like a shed, and they're fighting off a load of infected, and I feel like that was quite an interesting thing to cut, because it almost cemented that that David didn't want to kill Ellie. But I understand why they did it, because obviously it probably would have just padded out the episode. But I just felt that quite an interesting change, and I do hope we get more infected in the last episode and see it, because it's what they've changed with the Cordyceps and how it works, the tendrils and the one hive mind is such an interesting concept, and I feel bad we haven't seen more of that.
Yeah, Will, do you want to weigh in?
I think it's one of those hard things of, it's that tightrope, isn't it? It's satisfying the people who played the game and those who haven't. And obviously, the people that have played the game, they know how brutal and how much these the clickers and everything else can kill you instantly, pretty much. So we know what they're like. Whereas the people that haven't experienced Last of Us and watching the show have probably heard how the enemies are in the game and how many there are and that kind of thing. So when they're not seeing them as much, they're probably a bit like, where is this that I keep hearing about? And
sorry, well, carry on.
Oh, that's all right. And like the big bloater scene and everything else, it's all outside. It's not in confined areas, so it's sort of like we could just go around the corner like they did and they're out of trouble. Whereas in the games, there's a lot of the fights and stuff taking place in obviously these confined spaces, so it's that you're locked in with a bloater or whatever. It adds to the danger that you have to face. So yeah, it's a bit of a tough one. But I myself, because I've experienced the games, I think the pacing's great so far. But I do feel that the tendrils have been a bit underused. Like the whole introduction of them felt out that pretty much nowhere was safe at all. So even going across fields or whatever, you'd think you could trigger them somehow, but we've not seen any of it at all.
It's been dropped, hasn't it, really?
Yeah, exactly. So it would have been great to have seen a new scene or a new interaction with the enemies caused by this that we've not seen in the games. But
I wouldn't expect to see that in the snow anyway. This is
true.
Because right at the beginning, we're told that it was the fact that the planet was heating up and things were heating up. And at the moment, no, it's too cold for this. And then yet when the planet heats up, it happens. So in the back of my head, because I'm a massive overthinker, I've been thinking, well, surely there wouldn't be half as much in cold areas. There wouldn't be any in the Arctic or the Antarctic. I'm assuming that Greenland was a safe place to go, because these are all really freezing cold places. So the idea of there not being any infected in David's episode just didn't really occur to me, because I assume it'd be too cold to have many around. Plus, they're out in the countryside, so there would be fewer people anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I have a problem. I certainly don't mind that there were no infected in this episode. I think
It worked
I,
for this episode.
Mm.
yeah, I didn't miss them. I think just looking at the show as a whole and how much they've been used, I feel
mean,
like I
best
said,
get some
5
in the
minutes here, 5
finale.
minutes there. Yeah. Yeah. So, and I don't want it to be overdone. And the truth is, this is a really expensive television show, and
Yeah.
they have to pick and choose when they use stuff. So I understand it from you mentioned there, Abby, about them fighting infected in the games, these characters, and I didn't know that, and I think that sounds like that would have been an expensive scene. So perhaps
Yeah.
that money's being spent elsewhere, and the finale is going to be big. Yeah, I don't want to sound like I just want to see my monsters. It's not that. Like
Yeah.
I could not care. I do a Resident Evil podcast as well. We talk about monsters a lot. I for want of a better phrase, I almost could not give a shit about the monsters. It's about the thing I like is the character stuff, and this show does the character stuff amazingly. I'd love to have seen the infected do something that I haven't seen them yet. We're missing them. I mean, really, episode 5, and I'm very aware there's one episode to go, and so I'm just like, yeah, could have done with a little bit more, but we'll see. The finale, I'm assuming, sticking the landing is going to be it's always a tough job. I'm assuming the finale is going to be great. I mean, the show has been great. It's going to be very hard for them to cock it up at this point, but it's not impossible, so we'll see.
I also agree with Abby about the where we make the bloater. I would have loved to have seen him in an enclosed space, because it would definitely have been shit your pants and die then. It would I would have liked that. It would have felt more claustrophobic, but we got what we got, and people got to see a bloater.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the thing. I mean, The Walking Dead's been mentioned, and one of the things that they kind of did where they overdid the infected was they, or the walkers in their case, they used them as establishing shots in pretty much every kind of scene open, and it was like, oh, don't forget there's zombies here, by the way, and then nothing to do with them for the rest of the scene is just
stumbling around like idiots.
Yeah. Which I mean, there's also a point where people as a whole tend to have shorter attention spans nowadays for various reasons, like with so that maybe there does need to be some sort of reminder, by the way they're there. But I'm kind of like,
I think sorry to jump in, Phil. I just say, while I agree, what I do think sometimes we're in danger of doing is underestimating the audience. Now, this show, as I think you so pointed out in your notes, is being watched by lots of people. I don't really see anybody. There's some people complaining about the show. Those people we're not going to talk about because they're idiots. The people who are actually normal and sane watching the show, they're not complaining about it. So, like I say, maybe it's not a case of short attention span. It's not an issue. Avatar 2 came out. That's over 3 hours long, and it's almost the biggest selling film of all time. It's like, yeah, this. Sorry, it's just whenever anyone says that, I'm like, yeah, it does make me wonder, because I've got a short attention span, but I will sit and watch a 4-hour podcast.
Yeah, I think
it's weird.
It's. I mean, I don't think it's a rule certainly for everyone, but I think it certainly seems to be the way a lot of media treats people nowadays. Is sort of you've got to kind of constantly hook people in. You've got to remind people. It's that whole sort of, obviously because this is going on YouTube, that whole thing when YouTube creators always sort of hook them within the first 30 seconds, or you've lost them forever, and all this sorts of stuff. And it's like, I think The Walking Dead's the way the approach of it was certainly made for that, with that kind of mindset in mind. Whereas obviously The Last of Us said, you've seen them in episode 2 and 5, you know that they're there, and you've seen just how much they're this huge colossal threat. I mean, no one who said that we specifically wanted the Ellie and David infected fights back because in this scene, but I think using that as an example, if we had that in, and we had, what happens there was we got this small shack, and Ellie and David have got to use their own guns to fend off as like clickers and runners are diving through the windows. The way they've established them in the show, they would be dead. They wouldn't. There's no surviving that in that version of the infected, and I think that also probably makes it tricky to fit more kind of casual encounters in, I suppose, as well. That's the difficulty. You can't have the anyone kind of going around and just sort of silently shivving a load of clickers as you might in the game, just that sort of thing. So because again, if we had to play the game where the infected operated the way they do in the show, I would not be doing challenge runs on permadeath mode because that would be over so fast. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I think hearing different. I think there's a lot to be seen, and I am probably in two minds. Like a lot of people have kind of. It's good that they've not overdone it, but also there could be more, and it would be interesting to see more stuff kind of playing on some of the things that they've established, like the tendrils and so on. But I think obviously this was not really about the infected this time. We were talking about David was the focus of this episode. So one of the things that the show establishes from the very first shot, and we have David reading this scene from reading this passage from Revelations, and he's mentions that he's a preacher. He found God after the apocalypse, as he tells Ellie. And this is something that's not in the game. In the game, beyond being a cannibal, David and his community are basically a blank slate. There's not really anything there in terms of even in-game artifacts or any kind of notes. So this is apparently stuff that was supposed to be used and then was cut out, but it's basically all kind of been built up in the show. So it gives a bit more sort of in terms of like the overt kind of way that he operates and how he used that, and obviously being a predator as well, which I think has been made more explicit than it wasn't. It was still there, and it was very obvious, but it was also obvious in a more subtle way, I think, in the game. Whereas now it's quite the way the end scene, but the fact that he's not trying to strangle Ellie, he's trying to do other things. That is obviously a big thing. So, I mean, how do we feel about the way they've approached David as a character and how they've delivered it in the show? So, Abby, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, I mean, again, like you said, Phil, a massive kudos to, is it Scott? Is that his name?
Scott Shepherd.
Scott Shepherd.
Yeah. Because I was thoroughly creeped out and I thoroughly hated him, and I just felt his screen presence was just so uncomfortable from that very beginning. You know, I think most of us have probably met someone that's really manipulative or that we've got the bad vibes from, and you just get that instantly. It was just all the little bits again, like him mentioning that he was a teacher, and then the bit where the young girl mentions about her, like, whose dad's died, and she's like, oh, you should kill Joel, you should kill like the guy that killed him, and then the slap, and then helps her up, and just that how quickly he changes. It's done very well, because I absolutely hated him. And yeah, that change of David trying to kill Ellie to something else was sort of that final nail in the coffin, wasn't it? And I felt that was the first time, like, Ellie, we had a lot of Ellie really struggling and really, you know, like in episode 5, no, last episode, where she got bit and thought she was going to die, that sort of like defeat. But I'm kind of rambling because there's like Bella's performance was just so good, and you know, Bella just keeps excelling themselves. Like, they are just so incredible in the way that they put their own spin on Ellie. The chemistry, pardon the pun, between David and Ellie in this was just palpable, and it was horrible, really, really horrible.
Yeah, no, I don't think anyone would disagree with that point. That last point. Will, your thoughts on kind of how David was portrayed in the show and the cult that he's cultivated?
Yeah.
For lack of a better word.
Yeah, no, I think the initial, like the slight visual changes. So obviously he looks, I think he looks skinnier and more, I don't know the term, more ill. I think obviously they're not eating as well. So when that initial introduction where obviously they find the deer, it looks like they're just people trying to survive. Whereas in the game, they looked a lot stronger, I think. Whereas I think Ellie felt like she could probably take them on a little bit. So that showed how she approached the situation. But then they, when they talk around the campfire as well, I think in the game, doesn't he hold a knife while he's passing it around the fire? So it's a lot more threatening, and I think a lot more creepy in the way they're talking, because then he turns and he points the knife at her. Whereas obviously in the show, he seems quite chill and quite blasé. You don't get that initial air of creepiness. I don't think. You don't think there's anything too sinister. Obviously, if we hadn't seen that previous scene with the crying child and stuff, I don't think we wouldn't have thought that. But then that slight change in how he's talking in front of her on the camp, I think they've made the words speak a lot more for David initially than the initial characterization of him. So I quite like that different take, and it was something different and just a basic retelling of the game, really. But no, I think as you said, he was a right bastard, I think, and it's he did play it really well.
Yeah. ADB, do you want to give your thoughts on?
Yeah, I agree with what you said. What you're all saying. That for me, he's the most evil person in the show so far. I think hands down. It's this classic thing, and I like when they do this with villains and bad guys, where he's not really physically imposing, but those red flags are there from the start with just. And this is a credit to the actor's performance, his facial expressions, and the way he's delivering his lines. Like, I mean, I don't know how he's kind of presented in the games, but the second he opened his mouth on here, I was like, okay, so this guy's one to keep your eye on. Now, this is either going to fall on completely deaf ears, or it's going to connect with some of you. But indulge me for a second. So he shares so many qualities and reminded me so much of the character Benjamin Linus from Lost. Now, in Lost, this character is a guy who is leading his people, but he's lying. He claims to be leading them from instruction from a higher power. He's obsessive. He's a control freak. There's a section of Lost where Benjamin Linus is also a teacher, separate from the situation they're in now, kind of like the show here where David says he was a teacher before the apocalypse. The whole everything happens for a reason is like the overarching entire theme of the show Lost. The actor even looks a bit like Michael Emerson, and yeah, I just found it so funny while watching it, how he shared so many traits with this other horrible character that I also absolutely love. I thought the actor was superb. Yeah, he just made me feel sick to my stomach. There's a line, because I was watching him closely. I was like, okay, I'm not sure I trust this guy. This is a bit dodgy. The thing that solidified it for me is when they come back to find Joel. They've tracked Ellie to find Joel, and then she rides off on the horse. They're going to go get her, and he screams. I think he just screams, alive, or remember, alive. And in my head I was like, you sick fuck, that's because I knew from that moment, I was like, okay, yeah, you're not there, you're there to take her prisoner. I think the whole sexual predator thing, which from what I understand you're saying isn't a big explicit thing in the games, but it is here in the show.
It's not said out loud. It's kind of the hand holding scene in the cage still happens, and there's
okay,
but it's not as explicit with that last scene.
Okay, yeah. I mean, what I was going to say, I think the reason they ramp it up and make it as explicit in the show as they do, you said the ending was changed there slightly as well, is, and we might talk about this more in a minute, is when it comes to Ellie and, her kind of path as a character and the person she is and the person she's becoming, I think they needed to make sure that you really hated this guy, because there's questions about Joel, there's questions about his influence on Ellie, there's questions about Ellie, but I think at this moment in the show, at the end when she's beating the guy to death, there needs to be no question that she's justified in her actions, and as brutal. And
they were eating people.
Yeah, exactly. So this is what I mean. They laid it on thick because they didn't want you thinking that that Ellie was out of line in any way. And it's all just, I think, it's not done by accident, all this stuff and these little changes. They're not putting extra layers of sexual predator in the show for fun. They're doing it to lead you, to make you think things. And you're rooting for Ellie. It's horrible. It's horrific. The whole stuff is horrific. David is a horrific person. They wanted to make him as horrific as possible, and he was. He was the most evil character in the show, and the actor was great. Loved him. It's always nice to have a villain to love. To love to hate. So
yeah, and I think as we come on to D-Next, the amount of times where I've been replaying like the David and Ellie scenes, and you've just, even though I've not put any cutscenes on, you're just kind of giving him lots of sass just while I'm playing, and you're just like responding to his dialogue in the action. I think that's definitely true in your case.
I think last time you were playing, I just shouted nonce at the telly.
yeah.
Because I'm not sure if this goes along gender lines. I mean, I look female, but I'm not. It's like ordering a woman off Wish with me. It's nearly there. Something's off a little bit, like heading towards the non-binary-ish. But I don't know what is going on with people who go, "Oh, it wasn't as obvious in the games." Yes, it was.
I mean, if that hand thing was in the games,
No. Right from the very start of the first time you see David and Ellie interact, the look on his face, the body language, you're like, predator. Like, this guy is a predator. He's not just a bad un and a wrong un. He is like a real wrong un. He is that teacher who had his hands too deep in his pockets during lessons, if you know what I mean. You could tell and I don't know if it's people socialized as women who got this earlier than the men, but we didn't have to wait for that hand in the thing, in holding in the cage. We knew. We been knew. So from what I've heard from other women I've spoken to, the bit where she was killing him, essentially, the bit where she was just giving him loads with the hatchet, we were just busy, from all my friends watching it who are female and nearly female, we're too busy shouting, "Go on, Ellie, fuck him up," to be even thinking about anything else. Because in that moment, Ellie was us. Ellie was the us we would like to be if every man who's ever groped us on a train, if every man who's ever, like my feminist head is back, right? If every man who ever called us darling or love, every man who ever like got a bit too close on a train, any man who had to put his hands on our waist to get past. If we could, like, Ellie was all of us in that moment. And there was nobody, and I speak to other PhD researchers who are doing creative writing. I talk to people who are doing masters in this stuff, in script writing, and there is not one of them who has said, "Oh, I don't know, maybe they had to make him bad just so Ellie could have a go." Ellie is always, any woman is always going to be, any person is always going to be well within their rights to hack somebody's face off with an axe if they touch them and they're not supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of that. I think when people talk about it being more overt, it's not so much that it's not obvious in the game. It's more that like
they cemented it.
Yeah, the dialogue where he's kind of talking. Essentially, he's talking about like making her like his bride in that point in the cage. And the point where, as you mentioned earlier, that he says, there's no fear in love when he's on top of her. Obviously, those lines are exclusive to the show, and that sort of, it's kind of, as you say, piling it on. I suppose I think that's probably where it's coming from, because I'm not aware of anyone who's kind of in any doubt that Game David is exactly the same in terms of his intent and who he is. I think it's more the way it's portrayed is got those kind of extra layers to it.
I agree with you there. I think for me, it's more about the when do you notice? A lot of people are talking about this hand on her hand moment in the cell, but it was way before that. It was the way he looked at it. It was the way he sort of, his body language when she was facing away. It's
He doesn't stop staring at her like the moment
not the whole
she
time.
arrives.
does
So
he?
that's why you were looking like, hang on, mate. Yeah, something's not
Yeah.
right here. And you don't believe it for 1 second. But yeah, for me, like I say, definitely raising my eyebrows. And it's like, And then as soon as he said he wanted her alive, I was like, oh my God.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's a
I
lot
think
to be
it-
said
yeah.
about like the theme of female rage in The Last of Us, especially once we start branching out into part 2.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Oh,
You know,
yeah.
no
Yeah.
spoilers obviously yet about part
Cannot
2
wait.
and where the show will go, but there's a lot to be said about female rage and I don't think gender or sexuality is a massive part of The Last of Us. It's just a natural part of the world, which is cool. It's a really, really cool thing. But I think cementing that, we've seen how Ellie's almost idolized that violence throughout when she saw Joel beating that guard when they first escaped. And how she just really enjoys having someone care for her in that way. And that rage and that violence is now kind of eating her up. And so, like, another nice little interesting change is the fact that Ellie murdered the heck out of David and walked out, whereas again in the game Joel pulls her off of him.
Yeah.
So
Right,
Ellie
yeah.
finishes it on her terms and goes out and then meets Joel. I felt that was quite a poignant change as well.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the subject of Joel, because obviously he still plays a part in this episode, possibly more than in the last episode. Obviously, seen people saying that he paid however much he was paid for episode 7, basically to lie on a mattress.
I saw that. You mean the
Great
last
work
2
if you can get
episodes?
it.
But we've like, there's the moments where after the horse is shot and like David kind of picks Ellie up in his arms, like, and there's this moment which is very much parallel to when Joel's carrying Sarah, but in a very much darker and more sinister way. And I've talked about this before on this channel. I've made a like whole video about David and Joel kind of being like the mirror universe opposites of each other, if you like. He's the evil version, like, whereas Joel takes the sort of evolves into the role of like the surrogate father to Ellie. David actively seeks partly that, but obviously partly also the predatory role as well. And then is, rather than being moved by Ellie and changed by Ellie, he tries to change her to suit his needs, and he's kind of like the dark inversion of Joel. So I mean, this was there anyway, but I think that kind of probably plays a little bit more in that kind of imagery that we see there. So just wondering what people's thoughts are on that whole area, and if that's something that crossed your mind in terms of watching the show. So I'm just picking people in random orders now. So Will, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, no, it's now that you're saying it, it's you can really see those parallels, can't you? And especially in that scene where David's carrying Ellie, just the way he's looking at her, it's just pure evil. It's just, it doesn't let his focus is just on her. It doesn't matter what's around him, like the potential for anything around him, but it's just all about her. And how long he must have, obviously the situation that's happened previously for wanting them to get caught. He's built this up in his mind, knowing that there's this small girl out there that he's out to capture. And yeah, no, I never really, now that you've made those points, yeah, no, you really do see it, actually.
Yeah. KDB, thoughts?
Yeah, I think like Will's saying, there's no question that David is the evil one, and the parallels are there with Joel. He's the evil version of Joel, as you're saying. I don't think that. I mean, even with the end of this episode, as much as I cried and it upset me, and there's beauty in Joel and Ellie's relationship. Joel isn't sort of cleansed of his sins here, and as I've mentioned, there's questions about Joel. There is, and you're supposed to sort of ask questions about him. And because I know where things are going, I know that there's going to be questions about Ellie and why she's the way she is. So on the flip side, as a parent, I'm not judging Joel. I'm watching him thinking, there's stuff that he's done that's not good already. You know, he's not he's not necessarily a hero, but you know, if you want to paint him as a father figure, yeah, like, you know, there's stuff he's doing. I'm like, I can relate to him. I'm not judging him too harshly. Maybe I should judge him harshly, but then, you know, this is the apocalypse. This is moral conflict in these crazy circumstances. All bets are off, really, in what they're doing. So I love the parallels that it's like David is the villain in this episode that they're both coming up against, and then Ellie rises up and you know, sort of, you know, shines by herself and doesn't necessarily need Joel to save her. That's all fantastic. It's not as cut and dry for me yet that it's like light and dark, Joel and Ellie light, David dark. David is dark. He's the darkest. There's no question.
Yeah.
They're not, you know, they're not getting off scot-free. I will say, I think Ellie is still being kind of, I think she's still being presented as a, I suppose, innocent is maybe a word. I mean, that's maybe use a different word. As an innocent, she's a child still. Her actions have been justified, in my opinion, in what she's done. But she's a child. What's this going to do to her? What's being around Joel doing to her? Maybe Ellie shouldn't be where she is. Maybe she should be back somewhere else, and the world doesn't need saving. I don't know. It's questions. It's all questions. So yeah, I do love the parallels. I think it's great to point it out. Doesn't make it as simple as light versus dark for me, though.
Yeah, and I mean, I would agree with that. Like I say, I'm certainly not going to say that Joel's a saint. I think it was more because I think when you say, I know this has come up when people have kind of mentioned the parallels between Joel and David before. Some people have kind of took it as almost justifying David, and it's obviously absolutely not doing that. I think it's you know, the parallels there, and him being a dark reflection means that that's kind of inverting the way that two relationships work. It doesn't mean Joel's all good. I mean, it does mean David's all bad because there's no redeeming features about that man. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of. There's a lot of complexity in there. It's not sort of straightforward, as you say, light and dark. More grey and dark.
Yeah. Ooh, love a bit of grey.
Yeah. What about you, Dee? What do you think?
I agree, KDV. I don't think it is as easy as light and dark, but I do see that they are supposed to be diametrically opposed. But then we've got Joel torturing people,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, I'm a parent too. I'd do exactly the same.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Right?
talking
So
about.
it's
You're like, oh my God. Oh yeah, I'd do that.
Is the bad we're doing, or is the bad that the people are doing, is it justified? And does that justification mean that it's okay? And if it is okay, can we then say it's light against dark? It's like Philosophy Wednesday up in this bish. And I don't know, when he was torturing, I don't think he was doing so just as a father or
Definitely
as a
not.
father figure. There was part of him, I think, that had regressed to who he was when he was with Tess before he met Ellie.
Definitely.
Because he was focused. It was almost like he was dissociated. He was that focused. He was like, right, nothing else exists apart from me needing to do this and to get here. So yeah, like obviously David's evil. We all agree on that. But Joel, I'm having a hard time of seeing what he does as bad because he tends to have a reason for doing it.
Yeah.
Previous Joel, I think, kind of got off on giving pain, and I think we saw a little bit of that in this Joel. But
yeah.
there are many Joels.
I mean, on that subject of kind of regression to who he was, he did that whole thing where he kind of says to one of them, points on the map, and it better be match up with the way your buddy. And although it's a far less violent instance, that's something we've seen him use before with the native couple when he says, you know, it best be the same as what your wife said, and he has to ask if she's told the truth. That's obviously something that he's used to using as a technique, and coming back to kind of who he was before, and like in the 20 years since he lost Sarah.
Yeah.
So, what about yourself, Abby? Any more thoughts on this?
Can't say too much yet because I don't want to spoil the end in terms of is Joel the good or the bad guy.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you know the story, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's a quote from Bill in part 1 where he says, I'm quoting this quite roughly, but he basically says, like, the infected don't scare me, you know, they're predictable, it's the normal people that scare me. And I think that's true for everyone, for David, for Joel, for Ellie, you know, everyone's going to do what they can to survive. I think it's interesting to see that everything Joel does, for the most part, is for self-defense or for protecting himself. A lot of what David does is for self-gain. It's not to survive, it's for his own benefit, you know, it's for his own image, which a lot of the characters just don't have in it, you know. Most other people just do what they can to survive, whereas David's at that point where he's just being manipulative and doing stuff for his own gain. So that's all good. I don't want to say too much more about, like, is Joel the bad guy, because I feel like that's a conversation to be had a lot later.
Yeah.
After the end of the last episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean that's absolutely fair enough, and we will obviously forgo any spoilers until or future spoilers until the right moment. But just kind of, I think that point you're saying about David doing things for his own gain and how he operates, that kind of brings us on to, I suppose, the next point in there about how his community is kind of where we talked about him being a cult leader. We've talked about kind of the power he holds over them and whether he's starting to lose that power. But he mentions quite explicitly, like, that only a very small handful of them know what's actually happening. They don't know that they're not eating, whether they suspect or not, but they don't all know that the long pig's on the menu. So they're kind of there. And then there is still that deep unease, like with that moment where he slaps the girl's, the guy who Joel killed's daughter.
Alex.
And that sort of thing. So I think talking about how we feel about how the community operates and whether that kind of does that change how we look at them, or is that simply something that kind of deepens how sinister David is as a character? And yeah, so I think that's what we'll go into next. So I don't know what order to go in. KDB, do you want to go?
I will go, sir. It enhances David's sinisterness. Look, I'm not like a fan of this idea that doing nothing makes you culpable to a heinous act. These people are being abused. We can't hold everyone to the same standards of bravery as us. You like to think that, you know, watching a situation, you're like, oh, I'd never sit there and take that, or I'd speak up, or you don't know. You know, we've even done this. You know, you might have a minor disagreement with someone at work, and you won't say something. 3 days later, you'll be in the shower, and you think, oh, why didn't I fucking say that? And it's just like it's that times 100. You know, you can't. If you want to imagine yourself in this situation, would you? It's the apocalypse. Would you rather starve to death? You got children there maybe to help look after. All bets are off. So I do not judge these people. I think they are largely victims. And, you know, I want to touch on James in a minute very briefly. But, you know, there's children there and maybe parents that are scared for those kids. It's horrific. It's David's sinisterness that's what's enhanced for me by seeing the way he treats the community. I do have, large degree of sympathy for him. His abuse is on full display. It's not subtle as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, it's another way the episode goes out of its way to say, yeah, this guy is a bastard, as Will said.
Yeah, I mean, the next question I had, I think, kind of feeds into that, so probably bring it into this discussion as well. But like the fact that we find out quite early on that the person who almost killed Joel, who Joel then killed, is the father of that child. Like, and she's like there grieving and like she's lost a father. Does that kind of feed into this? Do you think, in terms of like they're doing all these things and they're probably doing some horrible things themselves, but they are in thrall to, you know, David?
Yeah. You know, I mean, I have sympathy for that girl that, you know, that whose father has died and she's getting beaten. I don't know much about the other guy, and just because he was a father doesn't mean he instantly gets sympathy. You can be an asshole and a father, and, you know, just look at Joel. So this is like a question I keep asking myself. You know, maybe you kind of have to be an asshole in this world. I don't know. I think yeah, when I think about the community and I think about the people that we've seen, you see conflict on all of their faces. I mean, maybe the guy that brings in the meat and says it's lies and says it's venison. It's like, I mean, he looks a bit shifty. He seems pretty fine to just carry on doing what they're doing. But, you know, even James, like, I'll just quickly touch on James. You know, I think just, you know, Troy Baker, like, shout out to Troy Baker. As I say, I've not played the games, but what he did in this episode, I think that internal conflict I'm talking about, the guilt, the questioning of David, just in those moments, even when he's like, you know, oh wow, you're thinking you're going to murder this kid, you're still kind of, I'm still kind of feeling sorry for him, you know. And I don't know kind of about you guys, but I thought for a cameo from a game actor, this was an incredibly tragic and understated performance. Like, I had no sympathy for David. I had definitely had sympathy for James, and I think that's a testament to Baker's performance. He didn't have a great deal of dialogue, but, you know, those facial expressions, anything he did say, he made count. And yeah, I think he is maybe a bigger representation of the community, because, all right, he was not doing great stuff as well, but I felt sorry for him, you know. I felt sorry for all of this community, and yeah, it all just enhanced, just going back to the original point, enhanced the sinisterness. Is that a word, sinisterness, of David?
If it's not, that's on me, because I wrote it down, but spell check didn't tell me not, so that's my defense.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Will, next, like, your thoughts on kind of how the community is portrayed and what the way it kind of feeds into the show and David's character.
Yeah, he's very vocal. No, I think it's a testament to how brutal the world that they're trying to survive in is that they've got two options: go out into the wilderness and try and survive, or live and survive with David, and they're choosing David. So they've obviously been at some point out in the real world, and it's a classic case of Stockholm syndrome, isn't it? It's just they're trying to keep that facade of this is how life should be. It's a lot easier than it is out in the real world at the moment. So there does sort of, you can see it in all the faces. They don't want to be there. And every interaction that David has with them, you can see that sort of sick, sinister smirk of emotion that he has all the time. Like, every interaction, he loves it because he owns everyone fears him, and that's what he wants. And he's using, now it's
Yeah. And they could have gone the other way, because we've seen it enough times in horror and post-apocalyptic stuff with the cult, where everyone who's a member is a true believer, and they all gather their pitchforks and torches. But yeah, it was definitely very interesting seeing the other side of that, and the kind of more timid flock who just have nowhere else to go, I suppose, as you say.
Yeah, but yeah, I think the fire at the end, with obviously they know where David must be with that interaction, and I think it kind of explains why no one's there. It's just because they got like, well, we're actually free now. If he dies in there, we can escape.
Burn.
Yeah, exactly. We've got the group. We know we want to survive. Let's just leave him be and just let's us go. He's probably gone off at that moment. There's no one there.
Yeah, let's go find some more real estate and move on.
Find the next resort.
Yeah. What about yourself, Abby? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to add than what other people have said. Just cycle back to my point that I said last of people do what they can to survive. If you've got a guy that comes in being like, I know what I'm doing, and has the confidence, they're gonna follow. Like, especially if you've got kids, and if you're vulnerable like that, if someone comes in and acts like a leader,
100%. Yeah.
They're going to follow, and then that plays into the whole, David being the shepherd and they're the sheep. So I hold. And The Last of Us, there is no bad guy. The bad guy is subjective. To some people, the Fireflies are the bad guys. To the Fireflies, the Fedra are the bad guys. Just there is no definitive light or dark side. Everyone has their own reasoning for what they're doing, and some are more morally corrupt than others, but people are just doing what they know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Dee, any more to add on all of this?
Yes. Yes, there you are. In Left Behind, I can't remember who says it. I think it's Ellie who says it to Riley. Something along, and I'm paraphrasing, something along the lines of, well, everybody dies. We could have died 1,000,000 times before today. So that establishes the idea that every time you leave your residence, wherever you are, you could die. It's a bit like these days, it's like you could go out and get hit by a bus. And in those days, it's like you could go out and get bit by a clicker. It's the same sort of thing. So this Alex, the guy who's the father, would know that going out and taking a gun to hunt somebody is going to be dangerous. And even if he's not thinking it at the forefront, he will know that every time he leaves his house, he could die. Right? So for me, I don't care the fact that his daughter's grieving. That's sad because people are going to grieve when people die. But it doesn't change how I feel about him. Not in the slightest. The fact that he's a father, like I'm sure that there have been all sorts of dictators and stuff who've done not good things, who've had kids. He doesn't give them a pass. As far as the community, I don't think they are mostly oblivious. I think that the two things can go in hand, that they know exactly what's going on, but they don't question it out loud and have it confirmed to them. Alex's wife is the one in the kitchen who's making the stew. And when the guy comes in and gives her the meat, and she looks at him and she says, "What is it?" The pleading in her eyes,
She knows.
please don't
Yeah.
tell me the truth. Because
Yeah.
if he tells her the truth, oh, it's your husband, surprise, then if he tells her the truth, then she has to deal with it. And I think that all the rest of it, we've got something there. Like if they admit to what's going on, if they're objectively and overtly admitting to what's going on, then they might have to do something about it. If they can just pretend it's not happening, then they can be with the guy who seems to know what he's doing, the one who's got the skills. But they know the ground's too cold to dig. Is it? Is it really, David? Like, I'm sure you got the tools. You could. But yeah, we'll have a funeral when you've forgotten all about it. And in fact, I'm going to slap you for saying something that everybody's probably thinking for the child, to make sure you don't question me again. So that was that reinforcement of who was in control there. And with that little girl who was Alex's daughter, he made sure that she would never question again where her dad's body was. So I think they know, but they just can't admit to it.
Yeah, in denial, although because they don't question it, that's why David thinks only a handful know.
Yeah. Where's all this meat come from, hun? Just the deer that everybody is saying out loud they haven't seen in 2 months.
I almost burst out laughing because you said it's your husband. Surprise, like husband surprise is like could have been the name of like a meal. You know when they say it's such and such surprise. So yeah, I know that was unintentional, but yeah, I didn't want to spoil the seriousness of what you were saying.
I love it.
My
What have we got for
specialty, husband
tea?
surprise.
Husband surprise.
Well, if we ever make Last of Us themed meals or something like that, someone has to have a husband surprise there. And it's
Oh yeah, like
ambiguous looking meat.
After the bar burning down, it'd be nonce barbecue, wouldn't it? Oh my god.
Oh god.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that bit where David and James drag in the deer, and they're like so happy with themselves, and like we got a big one, and everyone's just that silence, and everyone just looking.
Like, what
Like,
we eating now then?
Yeah, but no one will question it because David's got them gripped.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
I'm going to be giggling about husband surprise for hours.
We'll try not to make ask you to make any too serious points then at this.
If you ever want to make any merch for this podcast, there's your t-shirt right there.
Okay, so that covers everything kind of in terms of talking points around the themes of the episode and specific kind of areas of the story been told. But before we move on, has anyone got any other points that we may not have covered in terms of what happened this week that you want to talk about? ADB?
I sort of put my hand up like we're in class.
You may speak.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Yeah, just because I hadn't really sort of touched on it yet, I'd spoke about other things that I wanted to talk about, but excuse me. Just in regards to Ellie, I just wanted to say that, like, I think, you know, I've mentioned about the moral conflicts and the questions about characters, but this episode, as I said, is so strong, and it's because of how Ellie is presented. You know, this is her biggest episode of the season, I think, without question. I think it shows her in a new light. She turns a corner, and you know, there is a question: is this a good corner? Is it a bad corner? Is Joel a bad influence, or is he a positive influence? You know, I aside from all that, I love that we really got to see her shine, and I think as a viewer, from the start of this show, we've kind of been led to think that Ellie is, you know, this is the answer the human race is looking for. But she's a child, you know, and she's naive, she's reckless. And this episode does a lot to show us that she's had to grow up pretty sharpish. Her character traits literally get listed out by David, and he's not wrong. She's loyal, smart, violent. You know, these are hugely important bits of foreshadowing for her character. And the episode goes out of its way to show you that she can handle herself. She can handle herself against possibly the most evil person she's ever come across in her life. She can hunt. She can look after the horse. She brings. I loved that little moment of her getting the snow for the horse to drink. It's perfect. You know, it's there for a reason. It's to show you she doesn't need an adult to look after her. She can look after Joel. I mean, you know, injecting him with that much penicillin, I don't know. That's gonna you know, it's probably better than not doing it, but you know, it's we're not gonna nitpick. But she can do all of that stuff, even though that she's still a child. And then by the end of it, yeah, I just found myself I think I found myself at the end of this episode that she's my favorite character. And like, I've got a lot of time for Joel as a character. As I've mentioned, he's not necessarily a good guy, but he is a father. I can relate, or you know, he's a father. I can relate to him in that sense. I can relate to his motivations there. You know, he's pretty fucking moody. I think if everything that happened to me had happened to Joel, I'd be pretty moody as well. Yeah. To be honest with you, like, you know, I cut him some slack. That being said, you know, maybe he does stuff that I don't enjoy so much. Yeah, at the end of this, just Ellie is the MVP for me. And I also think, as far as the story goes, and as I mentioned, I know key moments from the games going forward. We don't know if the show is going to stick to every single thing. I have a feeling it may largely stick to it, but who knows? I just think going forward, yeah, I was so happy and kind of emotional at the end of this episode. And it was all focused on Ellie. I just thought, yeah, she was a big reason why this episode was so good. And I think this show, like, I loved episode 3, as I mentioned. I think episode 5 was my favorite before this. No, sorry, which was the one with maybe episode 6? I'm getting them mixed up. I think this is my new favorite episode of the season.
Cool. Any other from anyone else? Any more you want to bring up from the episode?
No, I don't think there is. I think ADB just summed it up. Though for me, it wasn't that last hug. I think was the only thing. That last hug where he says, "I got you, baby girl," and she was like, "And I've got you," and it was a case then of she'd taken a leap in growing up, and they've got each other.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big move forward for him as well. Maybe I did have something to say then.
Yeah, it was nice. Also, just at the mention of the penicillin, as someone that's just got off a really, really heavy dose of penicillin, oh my god, penicillin antibiotics. I was like, yeah, it's gonna help you, John.
Yeah.
I feel like we've seen Joel crack in the last few episodes in terms of like softening up, seeing after the Sam and Henry situation and seeing him make sure they bury them. And then obviously the whole thing in Jackson where he has a proper breakdown and then it's like, I can't protect her. And how sort of like soft he gets with Ellie when they're like about to head out. So to see that kind of survival instinct kick in, I was like rooted, like even though he's not, it's violent and he's not doing a good person thing, but when the guy from David's gang like came down into the basement, you just saw the empty mattress. I was like, it's go time, baby.
Yeah.
And the bit where he's getting obviously the where is Ellie and getting them to point on the map, that one line of where he shoots the guy in the chair and the other guy's like, he told, I'm not going to tell you, and he's like, don't worry, I believed him, and just no question, just getting to see that violence. And that again, the whole theme of The Last of Us is the circle of violence. That's the whole theme of the game. Well, especially the second one, but I think it's an overarching thing, that survival and violence, and how they will always go hand in hand, no matter like how hard you try to be a good person or do the right thing. The right thing again is subjective, but just seeing that really violent Joel come, I was so excited. I was just like, Pedro plays that so well, and then in contrast to the end where he does the "I got you, baby girl" line, and it's he says it twice, I've got you, and the first time he says it, he says I've got you, and he's looking at Ellie and he's reassuring her, and then he hugs her and he says it again, and you can tell he's really reassuring himself, like, I've got her. I've got her and I'm not going to lose her. So it's just that shift.
I'm going to cry again.
Yeah.
It's hitting me.
They're both reliant on each other now.
Yeah, because it wasn't the interrogation scene was a lot more brutal than what I remember in the games. Because in the games, after he stabbed him in the leg, he kills him from behind, doesn't he? So he's not looking at the other guy; he chokes him out till he dies. Whereas obviously in the show, he's constantly staring at him, stabs the other guy while staring at the other one, and he's clearly like, "I'm taking you both out now."
Yeah.
Whereas in the game, it's quite, is he going to do it? And then he hits him with the pipe. But
It's only a minor thing as well, but I noticed because I made like shorts where I kind of swapped the audio between the game and the TV show scenes and like dubbed them over each other. But the effect of stabbing the knife into the knee is a lot louder on the TV show. Like that's a much more forceful stab. I don't know what that says to anything, but that's just something I noticed.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add as well. Sorry, just to still go on. Because we've now come back around to it. Like this show, like as I get older, I'm telling you now, I'm softer and softer I'm more sensitive to everything at all ends of the scale. But then when it comes to violence and gore, like, it really does affect me. And, I'm someone who grew up like loving violent movies and gory movies and horror movies and stuff. These days I struggle to watch it. And I think this show is doing so incredibly well at walking the line of violence for violence sake and actually violence having an impact and a reason. I think I remember before the show come out, wasn't there like maybe the showrunner said we're toning down the violence from the games, and loads of people online were like, what, why are they doing that? And it's like, you guys, like, because if we just have 30 minutes of sneaking around and shooting people in the head, it's just going to lose all meaning. And so we know Joel is violent. We've seen it. We've seen him do things. This scene in particular, yeah, it's, again, it walked that line. It was just, I thought the balance was perfect in terms of what they show, there, and yeah, it's very dark. I was kind of stunned, when he did it. If they had shown more than they did, I think I would have just thought it was stupid. I thought the balance in that scene, if you're going to do like a torture scene, I thought they nailed it, to be honest with you. It was very hard to watch, but it didn't make me turn away in disgust, if that makes sense, kind of what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
No, definitely. But I think it's also a testament to when we first started, where we talked about obviously the lack of enemies in the show. I think who are you more worried about in this world? Are you worried about the clickers? Are you worried about the people? And it's we know why, like, the clickers and such are brutal, because it's survival for them, it's pure survival. Whereas now with the introduction of David and stuff, it's all about, they're doing it for pleasure. It's all the different motivations to what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the show. And obviously, as we've spoken about before, it's about the characterization of everyone and not just the enemies and the character and the world that they're in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that covers probably everything in terms of the episode and what's happened there. So just to kind of wrap up that section, just by mentioning, it's been a few weeks since we've had any of the viewing figures from the show, because the first couple of weeks we had the second highest opener on HBO, I think, after the House of the Dragon, and then the viewing figures went up sort of week by week. We now found out that this episode had 8.1 million viewers, which was apparently a 74% increase on the premiere, which shows kind of everything we're talking about, like how much of an impact it's having. And it was also the show's first billion-minute week on the streaming service on HBO. 1 billion minutes of The Last of Us were watched.
Listen, I think, I don't know how into it you all are, but I'm pretty sure those Pedro Pascal memes are a large reason for that bump in figures, because they've been more prevalent than ever. I'm not complaining. I cannot get enough of them. And yeah, I think people are like, oh, let's go have a watch of that show. That looks quite good. So yeah, it just shows the power of memes and TikTok.
Yeah, well, I will say that that one with Nicolas Cage and Pedro Pascal in the car, like, has been shown enough that I need to watch the actual film that that's from at some point now.
I mean, literally, yo aprendo español, pero Pedro Pascal. I'm learning Spanish just in case I bump into him.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, it's been a good time for Pedro Pascal, because of not just this, he's back in The Mandalorians, but he's in the biggest headline shows. But it's also, I think, good overall for The Last of Us. The Last of Us Part 1 has been nominated at the BAFTA Game Awards for technical achievements. I think we find out at the end of the month whether it wins at that, and that will come out around the same time the game comes out for PC as well. So it's quite, like, I don't think, despite how much praise it might have received in 2013 when it first came out, I don't think the franchise has ever been bigger than it is right this second.
Definitely not.
Obviously, the fact that we've sat here and spent 90 minutes talking about it is a testament to that. But before we wrap up fully, I mean, let's talk about what we're looking forward to or expecting with episode 9, which is the season finale. So just to mention, this section will contain spoilers for the ending of the game and potential spoilers for the next episode. So if you want to avoid that, then use the timestamps in the description to skip ahead. And with that said, who wants to open up their thoughts? Who wants to go first?
I mean, one thing that bothers me about this is, if Marlene is at the hospital when they arrive, why didn't she just take Ellie?
This is why didn't the birds just take the hobbits to
Yeah. Because storyline, yeah.
I know, but it just, I shouldn't have had Marlene there, I don't think. But yeah, I am absolutely on the edge of my seat waiting for this last episode. I cannot wait. Whatever they do with it, I know that I'm going to be screaming and crying and sitting and going a lot. And I will be exhausted because we're going for a poetry competition at the weekend. I'll be exhausted on the Monday. So it's going to be even more emotional. It's like, I'm just going to be the TikTok of the guy going emotional damage,
Yeah.
just constant through it. But I think that they can't. I know it's famous last words. I don't think they can really change a lot from the game in the episode. Don't know what the rest of you think.
Yeah. KDB, you've got the kind of perspective of, you said you know the major plot points and you know what happens at the end, but obviously you've not kind of played it through in that same sense, so there'll still be some
Not
freshness to it.
I don't think.
Yeah. So, like, kind of, how does it look to you in terms of where it's going now?
I would say I could have done with a couple more episodes. I feel like we're reaching the end too soon. If the events are going to unfold as I understand they will unfold, I feel like, again, it's hard to say because maybe I'll feel differently when it's all wrapped up. I hope they don't change what happens in the games. I think what happens in the games is a great ending, and I will be glad to see it play out that way. But I'm also kind of hoping for, just because I don't know, I like seeing people get riled up, some kind of subversion of expectations. I don't know. I think don't bank on it, like, this is an expensive TV show with a very expensive main actor. I don't know. I would love for there to be a surprise. I think the show,
Husband surprise.
yeah, that's a callback. I think the show has done very well to honor the source material, from what I understand. As say, I've not played the games, but I know and appreciate through other people that it's honored it very well, to the point where it's essentially one-to-one recreating scenes. Great. I think as a Resident Evil fan, seeing Resident Evil media completely do the opposite has often, not sat well with me. Sometimes it's not too bad. I think just as to like to see people get riled up, I'd love to be watching the finale next week, and for there to be something in there that no one was expecting. I think that would just top off this show, and it would make it its own thing. It doesn't have to be exactly like the games all the time. So, yeah, who knows?
Yeah.
I mentioned before on one of our calls, I don't think it's going to necessarily end on the exact note of the games. I think everything's still going to happen, but I think they're going to add something or expand on something. I don't think we're going to end on the line and then blackout. My heart is telling me, knowing how Neil and Craig have been working together in writing of it, Craig has been building on Neil's vision and filling in those gaps, and to me, it almost doesn't feel right that we end on the exact same note and the exact same pace, because that's just not how the show's gone. But I think we're going to get everything from the end of the game. I think it's going to pretty much follow the plot. Obviously, we've seen the teaser of Ellie's mum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we know we're going to get some more backstory in terms of that, which I'm excited for, because I really enjoyed at the start of the series having more backstory. And I think one thing I wish we'd had more of was the story building of when the infection first started and how the world reacted to it. I wish we'd almost got a whole episode of that.
Yeah, completely.
Because I agree the series has been too short. Obviously, it's very expensive.
Like, the cold open they did with was it in the morgue or something, like that scene was great. The cold open on the TV show, they're two of the best scenes in the entire season. You're right. So they could have absolutely. The show has paced out plenty of stuff. Another episode wouldn't have hurt it, and I think that would have been really good to get.
But as long as we get drafts, and
Yeah.
that's my main thing. But yeah, I'm very interested, considering Bella said in a recent interview, you know, they think that the last episode is going to really divide fans.
Oh shit!
Like
Really?
they've said
They
it's
did
going
say
to
that.
really divide people.
Does that
There's a
mean
surprise
does that
coming.
mean existing fans though, or talking
Yeah.
about the ending specifically, and obviously the lie that Joel tells, because that I think was potentially divisive in 2013, and there was a whole debates over whether he was right, whether he was wrong, and stuff. So whether there's like that will all spark up again for people who are completely unfamiliar with it, and then basically live through the whole debate again, or will it be something that divides those of us who've played and know the game, and then sort of going, I like this change, or no, this is an outrage. I must take up my
Yeah.
pitchfork.
I think,
I-
like Abby has said, they're gonna add something. You're spot on. You said it. This whole season has been about adding things and extending things and adding depth, and it's been some of the best stuff about it. So yeah, you'll get what you're expecting, and then I think something extra will be superb.
I just ask that they don't completely destroy me. That's all.
They
Yeah,
will.
very
Oh, they
true.
will.
For
Yeah.
the 7th time.
Yeah, because no, I was just going to say, like, it's they're usually on the finale, but it gives you something to hook you onto the next season. And I'm just wondering where the show will end. Will it go through with the actual full-on ending of season 1, or will it just stop before the last moment? Maybe. Do you know the whole thing with what Joel actually
think-
does?
Yeah.
People are going to be very angry. If there's
Yeah.
cliffhangers, I think you don't have a cliffhanger. I would
No.
be very frustrated. The show has already had a couple of cheeky cliffhangers for episodes, and
Yeah.
it's a bit annoying. Cliffhangers these days are sort of don't do them, and I think if you do it at the end of a series after people have invested 9 hours, you're gonna harm the hype of the show. So I see what you're saying, but I really hope they don't. It has to peak, and then it has to have a conclusion, and then tease the next part of the story.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
so
would
for the
hope.
tease, plot prediction, we have the bit where we have Joel making his decision, and then we have Ellie asking him about his decision, but then we pan back to the devastation in the operating theatre, and there
Yes.
is a girl crying
Yeah,
over her
that would be good.
father.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
so many girls have cried over so many fathers in this.
Yeah.
That would be, I think.
I mean,
tease.
that's kind of that was preempted what was going to be my next question, whether we think there will be some part 2, season 2 hints, because we got some of that in episode 6, where we saw girl who was very likely Dina. I think it was confirmed by Neil and Craig, like that she was meant to be like sort of in Jackson. So whether we'll see someone, a young girl, a little tiny bit older than Ellie with a braid, whose father is a surgeon, that sort of thing.
There is there's quite a big time jump, isn't there, between the two games? So do we think
4 or 5 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so is that something that the show is gonna cover? Because
I think they've said they have no interest in sort of doing anything other than adapting the actual events of the games themselves, the main story. I mean, the way that it'll have to be paced differently for season 2 anyway, because there's kind of the two kind of Act 2 and Act 3, or Act 3 and Act 4, whichever way it's structured, are basically the same time played separately because you play two different perspectives. So that would be kind of running parallel. But you do have the flashbacks to the intervening 4 years, like which kind of tell the story of where Joel and Ellie's relationship went, and you see that evolve at certain points relating to what's happening in the present.
And
So
The Last of Us 2 is so divisive for a lot of people that I think if they end on the exact same note that the first game ended, the people that hated The Last of Us Part 2 just aren't going to watch Season 2.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to want to grip people and have just something change and bring people in. So, cheeky plug right now, in our Last of Us cosplay fan film, we transition sort of between time frames. And we did the scene where obviously Joel takes Ellie out of the hospital, and then Beyond Believing, who plays Abby, comes in as young Abby, sees Jerry dead on the floor, and cries over him, and it's a shot where it zooms into Abby's face crying, and then it's just a silent transition to Abby's face, like looking over Joel on the floor, like literally just about to bring the golf club down.
Yeah.
So whether or not they're gonna do something like that, where it's just a really hard cut, and obviously people that haven't played the games are going to be like, "What?
What?"
Yeah.
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 That'd be a perfect tease. Actually, that'd be really good.
Yeah.
I mean, that I agree that would be like really good. The only reason I think that won't happen is because they haven't started, I think, writing season 2 yet, let alone filming it. So, given that it was renewed on about episode 3 for a second season, they probably haven't cast the actual final. Like the person who played Dina in episode 7 is, I would be very doubtful if the exact same person materializes as the character in season 2. So I think it'd probably be more. I mean, we might get something that's more of a teaser where we don't see some detail or whatever, and it could be easily.
I don't think they're going to do the exact same thing as us.
We'll just see Pedro Pascal's bloody face on the floor.
Yeah.
But I just think something like that would be an interesting way for people, obviously, that don't know the second game or don't know the games to be like, what happened in those 4 years?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I don't know though.
Yeah.
I wonder if
Oh, sorry, Will. Go on, you go.
I was just wondering if, obviously, Neil had to take something out from the game, and he saw something that will divide us that he's going to add back in. I wonder if that's what it will be.
We'll see.
We can only guess at this point. We'll obviously next week we can reflect and gasp in shock.
What I'm going to miss the most is when the opening credits come up, and that beautiful guitar is playing, and produced by comes up, and I say every week, Craig, amazing, am I right? I'm going to miss being able to say that.
You were going to say something, KDB, about
I was going to say, I mean, I might be speaking out of turn or jumping ahead too far. Just a question I have is we're sort of generally theorising about the future of the show now. And I guess we're nearly at the end, so we can kind of do that. But I don't know if any of you think this. Do you think this show, in the nature of television, the nature of media, the budgets and how things get put on TV. No, there's a reason Troy Baker is not playing Joel in this show, and it's not because Troy Baker is a bad actor. Do you think this show is going to get to, let's say, are we going to get to the end of season 2 without Pedro Pascal?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's such a vital turning point for Ellie losing that last shred of humanity that if Joel is there, you know, she has that person that she knows will protect her and that she will protect. Whereas as soon as Joel's gone, she just feels like it's her responsibility to protect everyone else, and no one can protect her, and no one has that power over her. So I think I don't know if we're going to lose Pedro quite as quickly.
Yeah, I think we'll see more flashbacks. Yeah. I think that probably even more than the game in terms of that. But
not only that, sorry to interrupt, I would say that Pedro Pascal is a big name in it, but everybody I'm seeing talking about performance is talking about Bella Ramsey.
Yeah.
So yeah. Even if Joel gets killed in episode 2, it will still be a success.
I think it probably will be episode 2. I think, like Phil just said, he will be in the show. You know, just because somebody dies in a TV show doesn't mean they can't be in it again. You know, and they may create new flashbacks and stuff like that. They've created new stuff for season 1.
No.
Not going that far.
No.
A lot of people are talking about Bella Ramsey. I just think, just from a cynical point of view, it's like it's Pedro Pascal. He's currently, we've said it, he's currently the he's the biggest actor on the planet at the moment.
Yeah.
There's
Cool,
no getting
slutty
around it.
daddy is everywhere.
Exactly. They're going to be sat in those meetings going, "Wait, we've got him for 1.5 episodes."
Yeah.
No, they're not. They're going to be
Yeah.
doing everything they
Yeah.
can. I think there'll be a lot of Pedro Pascal in season 2, which obviously I'm very happy about. But it was a question about what does that mean? They're going to change. How are they going to approach that? And I think flashbacks is obviously.
Yeah, I do think
best
like you definitely couldn't put it past like a studio exec to want to like completely change the story and have it basically be a rehash of the first season and more Joel and Ellie adventures just to bank on that big name success. I mean, that'd please a certain section of gamers who didn't like part 2 because they wanted basically the exact same story again. But at the same time, I think the one thing that kind of gives me faith that won't happen is like what Neil Druckmann has said about how it came to be a TV show from when it was originally optioned as a film, and they wanted to make it bigger and sexier in that kind of the way that we saw with the Paul W.S. Anderson Resident Evil films. And it's like, obviously we never got, a Last of Us where Mila Jovovich just came in and like completely sidetracked Joel and Ellie and with their own original character
There's
or whatever.
Still time, Phil. There's still time.
So
Not
I think
that you've got a beef about this, AB.
little bit. But I think the fact that he resisted that and like waited until he could do the show that told the story that was in the game, I think that kind of gives me more hope that that kind of executive meddling, which ruins it all, or just bad directors, isn't necessarily going to happen.
HBO have a good track record. It's fine. It is an interesting question because as we've said, so isn't this? So we've got Rings of Power, and then I think this is the most expensive TV show ever made, and then it's House of the Dragon is after that, and that doesn't. That's a big deal. This is not TV shows from 10 years ago. So I have every faith they won't mess it up. I do like thinking about this stuff. Because he's incredibly popular, and they're going to want him on screen in some way.
Yeah, because I also thought, with season 2, will they spread it over more than one season as well? If they want to keep Pedro in longer, they could stretch out over across 2 seasons, maybe.
Yeah, I think they've
They
said as much
with this season.
And if they're true to the bit where Joel meets Abby, you will get lots and lots of monsters. It's all good.
Yeah.
There's loads of them, and they're in the snow. Not that I've watched Phil play it a million times.
No, definitely not. So yeah, I mean, obviously we'll have to kind of discuss this after the fact once the episode's aired and we're here again to like kind of see, and then we can talk more about like say how long do we have to wait, 2 years or whatever till season 2, and it's going to be unbearable. But until then, have we got anything more that we want to add about predictions for the future, or do we think we just need to wait and bide our time now and let it actually happen? Yeah.
Let it wash over me.
I think we're at
Let
such
it
an
consume me.
unpredictable point now.
Yeah.
Everything else you've kind of been able to like, right, we know the David part's coming up. We know left behind, like Joel gets hurt and then Ellie has flashbacks. Whereas now it's like, we know the pacing of the last episode, but in terms of how this is going to end, I think we're in really like open water.
Yeah.
On a pallet,
I'm excited.
being pushed across the water.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, in that case, I think that will be everything for this week. So before we go, if I ask each of you to tell us where we can find you and anything particular we should look out for in the future from you. So, Dee, do you want to go first?
You can find me on ducktapeenddaddyissues.blogspot.com, but don't even try and get on there unless you're over 18. This week I have discussions about breeding kinks and what else? Breeding kinks. Oh, and voyeurism. So enjoy.
Cool. And KDB?
Just come and follow me on Twitter. K_D_B_, because I'm always doing lots of different things. First Aid Spray, Gears Intel, as you mentioned, and other stuff. Resident Evil 4 remake's coming up. It's going to be a busy busy period for a
Indeed,
few of
indeed.
us. So yeah, very hyped and excited. And yeah, I tweet about The Last of Us and other things I enjoy. Come and chat.
Cool. And Will?
Yeah, you can find me pretty much everywhere on Resident Evil Central. And yeah, as KDB said, Resident Evil 4 Remake is pretty much going to be our big focus for probably the next, well, probably won't seem like 6 months, I think. The rest of the year, maybe. As we deep dive into that and tear it apart and find everything. But yeah.
Cool. And Abby?
Yeah, I am Oplink Cosplay on anything. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, every social media platform, unfortunately. As mentioned, I am the official Atreus cosplayer for God of War Ragnarok. My YouTube has a bunch of work in progress videos of how I made my Atreus costume, and I'm looking to do a lot more video content in the near future. And then as mentioned at the start, I'm a producer for Spores Productions. We are a collaborative group of fans making cosplay content, like fan films and music videos based on games and random films like Interview with the Vampire. And we have some really exciting content coming up, which, again, if you're a Naughty Dog fan, keep an eye out because we're really excited. And then I will be at Insomnia Gaming Fest as a guest at the start of April. So if you're headed to that, come say hi. I'll be in the cosplay zone and judging the championships. So, yay.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again to everyone for showing up and talking with us for the last, bloody hell, 2 hours. So if you make sure you check out the links in the description to everyone and show them some support and some love. If you've enjoyed the podcast, then give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all of my content, including the last episode of this podcast, other videos on The Last of Us and Resident Evil and horror gaming, and my live streams, which will, like everyone else, be shifting towards Resident Evil 4 focus, I think, in the near future. Check out the links in the description to join my Patreon for as little as £1 per month, or donate to my GoFundMe and get your name in the credits of my videos, like those at the end of this video, who I want to thank for supporting me and my content. Thank you all for watching. See you next time.